Hi everyone. As Jan mentioned, I'm the Economist business editor, and for my panel we're going to look at the theme of making the future present. That is to say, counteracting short-termism in business strategy and investment. And the contention is, broadly, that businesses and consumers have by no means adjusted anywhere near enough to mitigate climate change. And to discuss this, I have two very well-informed panelists. Next to me, we have Michael Lewis, CEO of E.ON UK, and prior to that, Michael was leading the climate and renewables business for the group as a whole since 2015. We also have Giulio Boccoletti, who is the Chief Strategy Officer of the Nature Conservancy, one of America's oldest and best funded environmental NGOs. He's also Global Managing Director for Water. Sadly, our third panelist, Dr. Dagmar de Groot, who is the assistant historian on environmental history at Georgetown University, couldn't be with us today due to a certain climactic event, i.e. blizzards on the US East Coast, but he has sent some thoughts and questions for us. My first question will be for Michael, which is just very broadly, do you agree that a focus on short-term strategy by business has been hugely harmful for the environment in the past? And are you starting to see that change?
Thanks for the question, Tamsin. I think it's important to draw a distinction between, pure business strategy and strategies pursued in the framework of a government government policy framework. Of course, I think short-termism is not just bad for the environment, it's actually bad for business generally, particularly in a business like ours, which relies on long-term capital investment. We have to think about projects we're going to be in existence for 25, 30, 35 years. So we have to get it right when we invest. And if you look at the journey E.ON's been on, really over 2-3 decades, coinciding with my own career. I joined E.ON 25 years ago. Actually, it was Powergen, some of you may remember, in the UK, which was more or less a pure coal-fired power generator. And we've made the journey to become now a customer-focused renewable energy company. It's a fundamentally different business, although it's had the same name. And that has been in response both to the policy framework and the issues we've seen like climate change emerging, and also our own view of what the right thing to do at the right time was. And if you like, there were three phases. First is acknowledging there's a problem with burning large amounts of coal, which during the 1990s we certainly did, and we started to significantly mitigating that primarily by investing in combined cycle gas turbine plants. Then moving to a transition to a new energy world where we started to invest significantly more in renewable energy. That would be during the 2000s, and the business I worked in before, E.ON Climate Renewables, drove that. And then finally, transformation, where we shedded our old world assets, if you like, the fossil-fired business, and spun it off into Uniper, and we now focus on the new energy world, which is customers, renewable energy, and networks. So it's been a strategic transformation based on long-term thinking. But in the utilities, we've always had to think long-term. I think that the key is marrying that with the policy trends we saw, which I think we've done very successfully.
And how easy was it at the beginning? I mean, it seems like a very natural progression now, and one that the markets have welcomed. But right at the beginning, it was pretty radical. And I think RWE, your big competitor, took a while to appreciate and then to follow. Can you talk about sort of, when it was not such an accepted thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to 2014, when we announced that we were splitting the company, it was seen as a radical move at the time, and certainly E.ON has always been at the forefront of anticipating the next wave, as we did indeed when we set up our renewables business and started to invest at scale. But I think investors understood that we were at a strategic crossroads. We clearly articulated that there were two energy worlds, the new world, as I said, of renewable energy and tackling the carbon problem, and the old world of large-scale, centralised generation based on fossil fuels, based on global commodities. Those two worlds will exist in parallel, but we wanted E.ON to focus on the new energy world and solve the problems and build the capabilities there. And I think it was a shock when it was announced, but I think everybody quickly understood the logic behind it and why we'd taken that step. And as you say, RWE followed suit shortly afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Julia, can I ask you, I mean, how unusual do you think and how unique is E.ON's case? I mean, do you see many other businesses, going that far?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, the challenge we face is one both of urgency and, but at the same time, urgency on timescales that are inconvenient for business planning because it's urgent, but we are looking at a transition over the next 20, 30 years. And we need to see a whole bunch of things happen. And, we were mentioning earlier the problem of transitioning land use, right? So there was this question of what needs to happen there. Well, we've just published recently a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that shows that 11.3 gigatons of abatement are available from different forms of land use change. These are changes in the current structure of the agricultural sector, of the forestry sector, of the water sector, in order to go to a world in which less carbon is emitted or indeed some carbon is absorbed. And so on the one hand, if we are to succeed, lots of different sectors will have to go through the same type of transition that the power sector has gone through, and in particular E.ON and others have undertaken. And I would say that there aren't that many that are, I would say, maybe others will disagree, but I don't see many going through that change yet. But I also take solace in the fact that it has happened in the power sector. I mean, I do remember early on the discussions we used to have about how unlikely it would be that there would be a complete transition to a renewables-based energy sector in the next 20 years ago. And now we have a $300 billion industry that's at scale and gaining from economies of scale and able to produce at the right economic margin. Now, is it enough? Have we gone far enough? Probably not, and there's lots to do still. But I take solace from the fact that a large capital-intensive industrial sector has made such a transition. We now need other sectors to do the same.
Do you think there's too much onus put on business, though, and on sort of people as consumers? What do you think is the role of government and policy and people as citizens as well? I mean, are we just sort of turning to business too much now? I mean, there seems to be a trend, and you saw many American businesses saying we're still in when Trump pulled out of the Paris Accord. So there's clearly a willingness on the part of business to step up and do a lot more. But do you think it's unrealistic to put so much reliance?
I think it's unrealistic to rely only on the moral argument to get businesses to do it. I don't think it will work. I mean, so I think that the statements I can make on this are, number one, we desperately need incumbents, large industrial incumbents who are optimized for delivery at scale, not necessarily for massive innovation, to transition.
Can you give some examples?
Well, whether it's, let me say this for the water sector, right? So water utilities are akin to energy utilities, different types of economics, but nevertheless, water utility, think of a city utility. A city utility has a span of control of the landscape that's enormous because you source your water from watersheds that are far, far into the rural landscape, right? So how do you connect the payments of citizens that live in the city to the fact that you're a steward of landscape? You're deciding to build a reservoir or not build a reservoir or restore a forest or not restore a forest. So that's a sector that accounts for about $500 billion a year of expenditure worldwide. And some of that expenditure, most of that expenditure is capital expenditure, and it will need to change. That's one example. But the farming sector, the wood forest product sector, right? There's a whole number of sectors that are either infrastructure sectors or they rely on natural infrastructure, which turns out is a form of infrastructure. The hospitality sector along all the coastlines of the world. If you're a hotel in Miami, I would suggest that there's something to think about in terms of the transition of your capital allocation when you're thinking about the security of your investments. All those sectors need to change. Now, your question is, are we relying only on businesses and too much on them? The fact of the matter is that, again, if you look at the renewable story, it didn't happen just because businesses chose to. It happened because, A, we treated people not just as consumers but as citizens and allowed the political processes to reflect the desires of people to actually transition to a more sustainable energy system. And B, we put regulatory systems in place and in some cases costs to make the economics work. And frankly, 3, the public sector ended up absorbing some of the initial development risk. And all those things played a part. In the end, now you have a large industrial sector, and we're benefiting from their economies of scale to deliver technologies that we need. It's not enough, but it's certainly a good example of how this can happen.
And Michael, in the case of E.ON, I mean, it was to a large degree Chancellor Merkel's decision on moving towards renewable energy, phasing out nuclear power, that drove the company's transition. Is that fair? So you needed that prodding?
To some extent, although the transition had started before that. As I said, we started investing at scale in renewable energy back in 2007. And I fully agree with the point about it wasn't just business that made that decision. There was a policy framework. And it's critical, I think, that when you're undergoing a major transformation like that, that policy and business have to be aligned. There has to be an implicit partnership or an explicit partnership in order to make things happen. In the case of renewables, there was a very strong European target driven by the EU, as well as local targets or local incentive mechanisms, the feed-in tariff in Germany and the renewable obligation certificate system in the UK and various other things across Europe. Within that framework, we took a decision to invest very substantial amounts of money. But I think it's really important to say it wasn't a foregone conclusion back in 2008 that we would have delivered all of this growth in renewable energy, and in particular that we would have driven the cost down so far. Take the example of offshore wind, where we saw Vattenfall win a subsidy-free tender 2 days ago. If you'd have said that back in 2008, that you'd build an offshore wind farm subsidy-free, you'd have been taken out of the building. We were in a very challenging position. You know, we had projects like the London Array, where Shell had just left it. They were a shareholder with us, because they said we couldn't make the economics work, and we had worries about the technical risks. We had other projects, one which we'd already built, Scroby Sands, which was suffering major technical challenges, gearboxes, export power cables were failing. So at that time, it was a major equity risk we were taking on to invest in those projects. But we believed we could do it. The government backed us and made sure that the incentives were right, and that combination drove it. So that's what really pushed us in that direction. But you're right, of course, the closure of nuclear in Germany was obviously a major stimulus to changing the organisation. But we'd already started down the pathway of growing our renewables business in any case.
And Julia, I mean, I think you think there's perhaps too much emphasis on sort of new disruptive companies in renewable energy, the big incumbents in a number of industries.
Right.
Can you enlarge on that, please? I mean, it's every industry,
right,
from retailing to tech to what the incumbents are doing. Can you talk a little bit more about
that?
Yeah,
I mean, I think that it's an and rather than or, but I think there's an issue with just timing, right? I mean, sometimes we talk about these things in the abstract, but we've committed to transition that's quite soon. I mean, the point was made earlier that we're going to have to invest a whole bunch of capital in to make this transition. And the fact of the matter is that if you are starting today as a company and you're hoping to turn over, say, the entire fleet of cars that are out there in the world, well, it'll take a fair amount of time to get that done. So we actually do need the production facilities that are in place today to embrace some of these questions of how do you make the system more efficient. And particularly when it comes to things that are currently not in the view, but we think are critical, such as landscape-based solutions. So we sit on infrastructure that's not man-made. And that infrastructure absorbs today half of the carbon that we're putting up in the air. So we better make sure we, A, don't lose it, and B, probably also increase it if we can. In order to do that, requires investment through who? Through the farming industry, through the food industry, through the wood products industry, through the large landowners. And those are not necessarily disruptive industries, but they're necessary industries. And so we need to figure out how to move these incumbents. At the same time, we're going to be in this planet for hopefully a long time. So we also need an answer for the 50 years from now, for sure. But a third of the Paris goal will be delivered by land use changes. Let me put it a different way. We will not meet 2 degrees, below 2 degree target without solving the land use problem. We will not get to less than 2 degrees without solving the land use problem. That's a huge incumbent industry. In fact, it's been around for 2,000 years, which we need to somehow shift.
And how can businesses help governments manage the risk? I mean, they're used to managing risks in very long-term ways, which governments perhaps are not. What role does business play there?
Yeah, I think it's there's a voice of business, which I think matters actually a great deal, because business is a large employer, because I think this is a conversation about citizens, not just consumers, and so it's about what our cities look like, what our landscape looks like.
What do you mean by the distinction between citizens and consumers?
Well, often we think that the only lever people have is the marginal purchases that they make. Mm-hmm. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of the solutions we talk about are infrastructural solutions, meaning that the economics of the margin are not reflective of the whole cost. If you want to transition your whole landscape to something that looks different, it may be quite hard to do that just with marginal signals. And therefore, what typically needs to happen is that the public sector needs to underwrite, right? Just like we have utilities here, the water utilities that you rely on Thames Water, it was a large loss of sunk costs from the public sector that actually made it happen in the first place. You can only really get the private sector and the marginal market to work once that's happened. Mm-hmm. We'll need the same, I think, in this transition. We'll need the public sector to provide signals to the allocation of capital, not just to marginal. Right. And for that to happen, you need governments to make really difficult choices about what money's being spent, and intergenerational equity. Are we going to spend the pensions of the future on this other thing, right? That's a question susceptible to politics. Mm-hmm. Citizens need to have a voice on what they prefer for the future.
That makes sense. I'd like to open up to questions from the audience, please. If you could just put your hand up and wait for a mic to come. Does anyone have any questions for either of our panelists? Gentleman here, please. Could you just let us know who you are? Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Mark Hewlett. I'm from Atkins Consultants. I've got quite a simple question. I think it's listening to this very interesting discussion. The question that's in the back of my mind is, can we really achieve the scale of change that's required with a predominantly market-based system, or is there a need to look at other ways of organising what needs to be done, and with the market on its own? Because in the West, we think of these things as, we provide frameworks for a market mechanism to do its job. But if we look at what's going on in the East, for instance, China has just launched a huge program to replant forestry, using obviously non-market mechanisms to do that. Do we need to think a bit wider, a bit more out of the box to the model we've had for the last sort of 30 years, which is very market dominated?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. Julia, I think that's one for you.
Yes. I mean, I guess that, my previous answer was a little wonky way of saying that that's probably the case, right? I mean, because if you think, so let me give you another example. So hydropower is going to have to be a part of the mix of the kind of energy sector, the power sector, at least for the foreseeable future. And by the way, whether I agree with that or not is irrelevant, because it's happening. And so over the next 20 years, we're going to build as much hydropower as we have over the last 100 years. Most of that is dams. And most of that's financed by China through large foreign direct investments. And, Three Gorges Dam is one of the largest international developers of renewable energy. They own a quarter of EDP and operate in Brazil. I mean, it's kind of there's lots of Chinese savings that have been intermediated into the power sector in Africa, in Latin America, and other countries. Now, assuming that that's going to happen, you want to avoid that development, just like solar development or wind development, clears land. You want to avoid that those pieces of infrastructure add to methane emissions. You want to avoid that they becomes a kind of zero-sum game between the development of cleaner energy and other environmental targets that really matter. And by the way, if you're wondering, rivers are huge bioreactors, right? They matter for the carbon balance. If we destroy them, they emit about 3 gigatons a year. So why am I saying all of this? Because you need a lot of planning. You need a lot of planning to think hard about where you'd put, not a project by project level, but you need a lot of planning to think about how you'd actually place this type of infrastructure to optimize not just energy, but energy, carbon storage, biodiversity protection, and so forth, so on, right? And that requires underwriting by the states. Hard to get the market to pay for planning. It's possible, but it's really quite hard, because the early stage planning you need is very remote from the commissioning of the individual pieces of infrastructure that enter into power purchasing agreements. And so you need to figure out a way of doing that, and the public sector may have to play a role in that. It may not be just a marginal market solution.
May I just jump in and answer? Because I think I more or less said the same thing as well. as I said before, the growth in renewables didn't just happen solely because of market mechanisms. There were strong public policy incentives to do it, driven by the EU, driven by the member state governments. So I would say that the market plays a really, really important role in allocating resources, but it needs to be steered by public policy, particularly when you're dealing with a long-term problem like climate change. And that is what generates the success we've seen in terms of driving down the cost of renewable energy.
And Michael, can I ask? I mean, when it comes to public policy and governments around the world, I mean, obviously a key problem is that climate change is a global problem, but faces national approaches. What role can business play in geopolitics to help governments kind of create sort of joined up global approaches?
I think one of the most important things we can do is show that we can create solutions in the right policy framework. So if you look, renewables is one great example where Europe led the way, Germany and the UK playing critical roles in that. The next big challenge, now that we've in a sense solved the problem of renewable energy in that we've brought the cost right down to be, in fact, more competitive than fossil-fired fuels for power generation. The next big challenge is decarbonising transport and heating, or electrifying transport and heating based on renewable energy. That will need a policy framework. I think Europe, again, can be in the leading position there, and it's about creating the right frameworks, partnerships between business and governments, which shows by example that we can grow this infrastructure of charging points, we can drive the take-up of electric vehicles, and that will be by creating the right policy framework in the European space and in the UK outside of the EU. And that then serves as an example, and business can take those examples and use them in other countries, which is what we've done in the past. We've built the business in one country, Denmark, we're way ahead in electric vehicles, and we bring that to other countries.
That absolutely makes sense. Any further questions? The gentleman over here, please.
Thank you. My name is Chaitanya. I work with a think tank called Green Alliance. I primarily focus on energy, so my question is for you, Michael. One of the ways short-termism, or as I like to think about it, the financialization of the energy sector, how it manifests is potentially reduced spending in innovation and R&D. I'm curious to know where E.ON stands compared to the average R&D spend in the private sector in the energy space, the energy industry. And could you be doing more? And this is prefaced with the fact that the state at this point spends a lot more on innovation, on R&D than the private sector.
I mean, we've always tended to focus our efforts on practical R&D and practical problem solving. So again, in the renewable energy area, much of our effort was spent on building real projects, experimenting with them, and trying to drive down the cost with a combination of public and our own R&D. We decided very early on, going back to 2006-07, that we wouldn't just try and build any particular renewable technology to harvest subsidies. We looked at which ones had the potential to drive down the cost, and we concluded that was solar, onshore wind and offshore wind. We believed we could get them to a levelized cost of energy that was the same as or lower than fossil fuels. So we focused on them, we put our efforts into them, and I must confess we were much more successful than I actually thought we'd be. The cost has fallen much quicker. But that's the kind of innovation we do, and we do a lot of innovation around electric vehicles. We hold a number of investments in some tech startups as well. I don't have the number off the top of my head is what proportion of R&D spend do we have compared to the rest of the sector, but I can say our focus is now shifting downstream to the electrification of transport, to the electrification and decarbonisation of heating.
And there was another question over, just further over in the room, I believe.
It follows on a little bit from the first question. There are a lot of companies that are showing leadership to take us towards a more sustainable world, but there's also a very large number of companies that aren't. And that sort of short-term focus on shareholder returns is sort of still remains very much the main focus. Do you think that a much more standardised benchmarking tool, such as that one, the one developed by FutureFit, which is being adopted by organisations such as Body Shop, do you think that's the sort of thing that could make the difference and speed up the rate at which other companies follow suit?
That's an excellent question. Michael, would you like to tackle
Well,
that one first?
I mean, first thing I'd say is, going back to the answer I gave earlier, I think a strong public policy framework is critical for driving us in the right direction. And in the energy sector, because we are such an important and critical part of the global infrastructure, and indeed such an important contributor to moving us or solving the problem of climate change, we've had a lot of public policy drivers to move us in this direction. But I think it's fair to say E.ON has always been one step ahead of that curve. In relation to other sectors, I think benchmarking is always helpful to show where you stand in relation to your peers. But I don't think it's enough unless it's backed up by concrete policy action. Benchmarking in itself won't change anything unless consumers are highly sensitive to the results of those benchmarking, and I don't think experience tells us that they are. So you have to back it up with concrete policies that aim to change the benchmarks and drive you in the direction of the best.
Julio, I'd like to hear your answer on that question.
Yeah,
as well.
you know, we need, transitions are hard, and you probably need a whole bunch of instruments, including transparency, and it's certainly an important element in kind of fostering the dialogue. You know, in the end, I do think economics works, and at the margin, you know, those large signals are necessary, particularly if you want to make the sort of transition that we're talking about. And so, you know, I see the role of civil society organizations, whether they provide benchmarks or whether they create platforms on which people come together, to have governments, citizens, and businesses having the conversation about what the future looks like. That needs to be valued somehow, and that is then the source of the incentive that drives the transformation. It worked well, or relatively well, in the renewable space. We need to figure out how to do it across a whole bunch of other industries.
Mm-hmm. And Julia, on the Nature Conservancy itself, I mean, you have, the organisation has in the past attracted criticism for being too close to business. For instance, in the wake of the BP disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, you were close to BP, had funding from it, although it was completely disclosed. In 2014, there was discussion of the fact that the Nature Conservancy was earning money from an oil well on your land. How does the organisation sort of walk that line between sort of environmentalism and yet representing business interests? Yeah,
it's an important question. I mean, you know, it's a fine line and it's a tricky one, and I don't want to be Pollyannish about it. I mean, I think that when you get involved in, you know, we're a very significant landowner in the United States. We are sort of the equivalent of the National Trust here, right? We own lots of properties, many of which we protect, and it can get complicated. And so how do you mitigate for risks, for mistakes, for things that can happen, and how do you mitigate for the risk that the partners you work with are not actually just good, right? And it's a fine line. I would say, we're not Pollyannish about it. We know there's risks, but we think it's necessary to engage. I don't see us solving these issues at scale without the engagement of the large incumbents and without the engagement of large companies, number one. Number two is we are a heavily science-based organization. We publish, like at Minor University, you know, the statements I made earlier about the transition, those are published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Science helps us being transparent and kind of gives a grounding for the statements that we make. This is not just propaganda. This is kind of verified science. And then the third thing I'd say is it's really important to us to try and bring communities, businesses, and policymakers and governments together. You know, we don't always succeed, but that's what we try to do, and I think that's the only game that will get us to the scale of change that we need.
Mm-hmm. And just one last question on E.ON's transformation, Michael. So you're now selling the rest of Uniper, which has the fossil fuel assets, to the Finnish company Fortum. What happens to those assets? I mean, do they carry on belching stuff into the atmosphere, or, you know, I mean, so you've distanced yourselves from it. What happens to the rest of it?
The truth is, for a period, we still need flexible fossil-based generation. Now, the rate at which that will fade out will depend on other things. For example, how quickly we can develop solutions to the intermittency problem of renewables. So enhanced storage, or indeed improved demand-side management, where we have consumers directly taking part in the wholesale energy market. Those solutions we're in the process of developing, by the way, with things like a virtual power plant. So our view is the sooner the new energy world is able to develop all of the necessary tools and structures, the sooner the old energy world will close down. And that's why we're focused on the new energy world, to make it happen as quickly as possible.
That makes sense. I think we've got time for one more question. Gentleman here, please.
Thanks. Mark Stevens from the Global Resilience Partnership. I just wanted to shift the focus onto the adaptation side of things, and particularly to sort of parts of the world where that's really the priority. Marginal areas in the Sahel, Horn of Africa, Southeast Asia, which are currently not large recipients of foreign direct investment. Perhaps not top of mind for businesses. So what would it take to kind of transfer some of the creative thinking, some of the success stories that we've been discussing on the mitigation side in the market economies, to finding solutions in those really very vulnerable areas?
Well, I can offer some thoughts. I mean, I think that the, California and Ethiopia face very similar meteorological problems. The experience is rather different, right? And the difference is, in fact, the capacity of these two societies to absorb those risks. So what kind of investments can you make in a place like Ethiopia or Kenya or other sort of either least or middle-income country, least developed or middle-income countries, to lift up their resilience? And the good news, I think, is that a lot of the things that I was talking about on the mitigation side, the kind of change in land use, actually are also resilience interventions. The great thing about ecosystems is that they offer multiple services at the same time. That's why it's important, for example, to restore coastline. If you are in Louisiana, I was telling somebody earlier this, in Louisiana we're losing a football field every 45 minutes of the coastline, right? Now, one solution is you build a wall. You don't solve that problem. You don't necessarily, but you mitigate, right? But you may have a problem down the line. Another solution is to invest in wetlands and restore the ecosystem so that it continues to generate over time and protect the populations on the coast. The thing about that solution is it's cheaper. And so it's actually accessible also to developing countries. And so I think that as we shift towards natural infrastructure solutions, what we'll find is that they sit much lower in the cost curve of adaptation. And so they offer some early stage investments for countries that may not be able to afford the highly engineered systems that developed countries enjoy. I'm not saying that they shouldn't get those. I'm just saying that those are some of the earliest and most cost-effective steps they can take on the path to development.
Great, thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this subject. I think the main takeaway for me from that session was just that market forces by themselves aren't enough, that there needs to be strong public policy and action from governments, and also consumers behaving as citizens, not only as consumers, if we're to move forward with decarbonisation, transport and heating and other areas. Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to hand back to Jan for an interview with The Body Shop. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you.